to EMS and The Economist. The Economist this week is Shawn Dubravac. Shawn, thanks so much for joining me. Always a pleasure to chat. How are
Great
you?
to be here. Yeah, doing really well.
Good stuff. So speaking of doing really well, how's the economy doing in general terms? We saw the first sub 10% inflation figures in the UK come out this week. So some positivity there. The sense I'm getting from EMS guys is that those that are in, I guess, non-consumer facing industries are still not seeing any drop off in demand, but they are seeing an easing in supply. So generally people seem happier than they were maybe 6 months ago, which is, I guess, a surprise to quite a few of us.
I think you summed it up quite well. Headline inflation certainly is coming down, and that's good news. We will probably have stubborn inflation for some time. So, we're still seeing relatively high airline tickets or, other things like that. So I think it'll take some time for the pressure to really move away from that. But you are seeing the headline numbers improve, along with on the negative side, a slowing economy. So it's happening in the US, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Asia after an early lift from the reopening there. You're seeing things slow down now. As you noted, the consumer segment has been slowing for some time through fits and starts, because you still have a household that is in pretty good shape. They still have strong savings left over from the pandemic. Labor markets are still pretty strong. Certainly in the US, they remain strong, despite what looks like a lot of layoffs in the tech sector. You still see pretty low unemployment rates. And so people are finding new jobs pretty quickly. And so that's keeping the household sector intact, at least for now. Obviously, the big looming issue here in the US is the debt negotiations and the debt ceiling. There is some concern that come June, without a lifting of the debt ceiling, we may run into a moment when the U.S. Treasury can't pay all of their bills. That has never happened before. It is the hope of many that will never happen.
Yeah.
But without Congress and the White House coming to terms and agreeing on a solution, it could happen in the first week of June. So
yeah. It's a strange one, isn't it? I look at it from overseas, and having lived in the US as well, we see it time and time again. It's the White House and the Capitol seem to be playing chicken constantly, and the outcome thus far has been the same and should be the same. The idea of the US defaulting on its bills when it is when the dollar is the go-to currency just seems insanity. Is it just flexing muscle? Is it just, are people getting something else? Is there something in the negotiation that they're winning on, or is it just a power play?
Well, it is certainly a negotiation in that both sides want something different, and who will win remains uncertain at this point. You would hope for a compromise where they both give a little, get a little, and that we come to some resolution. We don't actually know what would happen if the government were to miss some of their payments, if they were essentially to default. We always assume that the consequences are severe and quite negative. But it's never happened, so we don't really know. We know that financial markets don't like new surprises. They don't like when something new happens. And so the presumption would be that the financial markets would have a very negative reaction to that. So this is I think a theme of the U.S. economy and the U.S. politics that will continue for many years ahead, and it will be dependent upon who is in office in the White House and who controls Congress.
Yeah.
to how this plays out. Now, it wasn't a new issue. It was known in the fall. They could have taken care of it in the fall, and it wasn't taken care of in the fall. And so as a result, it comes down to the final minutes. The great risk is we don't really know when the final minute is. So we think there's some chance that it's in the first week of June. It may not be, and it could be that we get some temporary solution that kicks us down to a few months down the road and moves us into the fall. And this has to happen all again. We have to go through this whole process again.
Okay, well, it's a strange one, isn't it? But I guess the closer you hold people's feet to the fire, the more leverage you have. We're at episode 6 of EMS and The Economist, and every episode we've talked about the looming recession around the corner. And it still seems to be around the corner. Is it getting closer, or is it the same distance away? What's your view on when we will see 2 consecutive quarters of shrinking economy, or are we just pretty much flatlined at the moment?
Well, definitely you are seeing momentum slow. I mean, we just mentioned the debt ceiling. Obviously, if there is any type of default, even of a minimal nature, that would probably send us over the edge quite quickly and would push us into a recession quite quickly. Now, that too could be a short-lived recession, but I think it would be a much deeper recession than we might otherwise have. We'd probably see a spike in unemployment. We'd probably see a lot of things happen negatively to the economy if that were to happen. So if the debt ceiling is, and those negotiations aren't settled, and then this fallout happens in June, we probably move pretty quickly into a recession. Barring that, presuming that that is all resolved, I think we do have this kind of waning economic growth that will just continue to slowly erode. And as we move into the back half of the year, then we're really looking at, typically you need some shock to happen. In Europe this fall, that could be cold temperatures that drive up the demand for heating oil and for other things, and so it could be something like that drives it. It could be some other geopolitical risk that plays out. It could be some natural disaster that that plays out. We're in an environment where the global economy is quite weak, and so anything could kind of push us over the edge. So it's very difficult to say when exactly a recession might start, but we definitely head into the back half of the year on weaker terms than when we started the year.
Yeah, it feels like it's just delicate at the moment. I think that's the best word to describe it. You mentioned geopolitics, and one of the main topics I wanted to cover today was that kind of intersection between economics and geopolitics. And I feel that there's a economic side to the geopolitical shift we're seeing at the moment. Obviously, there's shifts that have happened because of the supply chain, because of relationships with China, because of war in Europe and various different elements like that. But what we're also seeing is an increase in consumer demand in China, an increase in consumer demand in Southeast Asia. 700 consumers in Southeast Asia that are substantially younger than many of the other economies and growing economies there. When you look at that geopolitical shift with your economist hat on, how do you see the two kind of impacting upon each other?
I mean, I think as you noted, we're in a very delicate environment, and what we've seen is that as demand has slowed, it actually freed up some of the pressure on the supply chain. It made inputs easier to get a hold of. That allowed a lot of companies to produce more and fill some of the orders that were lingering, satisfy some of their backlog. And so that we saw that initial drive there. And I think, and in some sectors, there's still quite strong demand. You look at the U.S., you've got some bills that have passed that will drive investment in a number of categories over a very long period of time. And so you have those dynamics playing out, and then you layer on top of it, some of these geopolitical dynamics that you talk about. And in many cases that produces this layer of uncertainty, which causes companies to second guess investments, to delay investments, to maybe slow down decisions on different business operations or business practices. And so those are all of the things that are kind of playing out at the same time.
Yeah, and when I look at capital investment, you make a really interesting point there. There's several government incentives both in the US and Europe and even elsewhere like South Korea that are driving growth in that area. When I talk to the suppliers that supply the EMS industry, they say the middle tiers are continuing to invest and doing quite well. It's the top dozen or so EMS companies that are being extra cautious because they don't know what's happening in terms of the economy. So it's those that are seeing the slowdown. The other thing I hear from people is they're moving to a more regionalized model. So they're perhaps, if they're an Asian company, they're perhaps investing more in Mexico or perhaps in Eastern Europe to be closer to those markets. And I think that's important. They're maintaining some strong footprint in Asia and in China because they have consumer demand in there. And then what becomes a challenge with that very complex global footprint is figuring out all these incentives, figuring out all these government legislations, and I guess trying to second guess what people are going to do next in terms of incentivizing or providing tariffs. That creates a very complex ecosystem for them.
Yeah. So just reacting to a couple of things you said, I think one of the reasons why you see some of the largest EMS companies become a bit more thoughtful or trepidatious is because many of them have pretty strong exposure to the consumer market. And so they're in sectors that are facing the stiffest headwinds. The regional shifts, while they were in progress really before the pandemic began, certainly some of them accelerated during the pandemic, they are happening on the margin. So these are relatively small shifts compared to the aggregate industries that are installed in these different regions. So I think those shifts are going to continue really long into the future because they're moving based upon the tastes and preferences of their consumers and the end markets that they serve. We've learned that long, efficient supply chains are also brittle at times, and so there is some cost to that. And while we thought we had pulled all of the cost out of the supply chain, we realized by making them long and efficient, we have inserted some of this cost through the brittle nature of the supply chain. So there are adjustments that are happening there, but again, these are small relative to the whole of the market, and I think they will continue for some time.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's that people came into this year with a big backlog. They came into this year off of a bumper year in 2022. Many companies had substantial growth. The ones that didn't were generally those ones that were suffering from consumer headwinds. Some of those very large Taiwanese-owned EMS companies had smaller percentage growth, although they're the elephants in the room anyway. So they're still a substantial part of the business. The interesting thing when I look at the economics of the supply chain is I was in a event with Eric Miskell yesterday where we were talking about freight and logistics, and in the middle of the shortages, freight and logistics was playing a very significant role and was very expensive. And what I was hearing yesterday was that freight has returned to relatively normal prices, and in some cases, the cost of freight from Asia to the west coast of the USA is cheaper than it's ever been, which surprised me. I don't know if you've noticed that, or whether you think those freight costs coming down will slow down regionalization. What do you think?
Again, I think it will, and some of that regionalization is playing out over many years. This is not. These are very thoughtful decisions that companies are making, and so they tend to make these type of investments over longer horizons. But definitely, you note that freight costs have come down significantly. That's one of the biggest signs of easing in the supply chain is how quickly and how significantly freight costs have come down, especially for waterborne, movement of freight. But you're seeing other places as well. In the U.S., we aren't necessarily seeing trucking rates back to where they were pre-pandemic, but air freight rates are down, and certainly containerized on water freight has come down significantly and back to essentially pre-pandemic levels. So.
Yeah.
And I think that will continue. I mean, that's just a sign of slowing demand, slowing global economies across the board.
Yeah, and I think as we get to the end of that bullwhip effect that we had from the pandemic, those things return to something that's more normal. And, people realize that although we've perhaps shifted our model in some ways, what we were doing in the past actually worked as well. So much as people are kind of reducing dependence on China, every large OEM I speak to says that China is still a significant part of our forward planning, both as a consumer market, but also as a first class, lower cost environment with great infrastructure, great supply chain. So yeah, it's curious. We get excited and we talk about these major changes, but as you say, they do tend to be at the fringe, and they tend to be quite minimal.
Yeah, I think they will continue to play out. I mean, I don't think they are the result of just the pandemic. I think that they will continue to play out because companies are always looking to optimize their operations and to fine tune. And I do think the tastes and preferences of end markets are shifting. And so being able to produce in those markets makes sense. I mean, in just the last few months, we've seen manufacturing for a variety of different categories grow in places like India. Now, India has obviously some unique regulatory environments that drive production in India, but you're seeing them become a bigger player in smartphone manufacturing, for example, exporting and what's being produced there. So I think it continues. Now, does India become the dominant smartphone manufacturer tomorrow? No, but does it continue to gain share? Probably. I think partly because it has a growing domestic market. It's a very big domestic market, and also as you start to build out that infrastructure, it will be the newest infrastructure by definition, and probably therefore the most efficient infrastructure. And I think that's also one of the dynamics that's playing out right now is that the Chinese industrial base is also aging, and so it as new capacity comes online outside of China, it is the most effective, most efficient, manufacturing equipment, manufacturing lines, and so it will, I think, naturally start to produce.
Shift.
To produce more of the share.
Yeah, and I think the availability of talent has an interesting part to play in that. The Philippines
Definitely
has a large talent pool and an average age apparently in its mid to late 20s, which is decades younger than Europe, Japan, China, the USA, various different regions. Plenty of change ahead, plenty going on. We'll be talking again in a couple of months. I'm hoping that the debt ceiling issue will be will be resolved, and the incoming recession is still in the distance. So we'll talk again and see how that goes. In the meantime, thanks so much for your time, Shawn.
Always great to join you.